In the last of this year's State of the EVs in the UK interviews, I speak to Tom Callow of BP Chargemaster. So, Tom, thank you ever so much for spending time with us today. Really appreciate it. Last time we
Pleasure.
spoke, it was in a very noisy hall in Fully Charged Live last year.
Silverstone, yeah.
Yeah, it was really exciting event that was. But you had an exciting day that day because you launched your new chargers, and we talked a lot about your strategy for the coming year. Obviously, this year hasn't quite turned out how any of us expected it, but you do seem to have made some quite good progress.
Yeah, I mean it's been a very challenging year, obviously all round. I think for the industry as a whole. One thing that we've obviously benefited from massively is BP as the parent company. Obviously, some of the sort of smaller players have had to take some tough decisions. If their sort of structures aren't necessarily quite as let's say secure. We're very fortunate with obviously BP as the parent company to not have to go through any particularly big pain sort of during the lockdown period, for example. We basically sort of ceased operations for a period. So we paused operations over the lockdown period. We stopped installing home charge units, obviously for safety reasons. We stopped installing public charging points. Obviously, our workforce couldn't necessarily maintain social distancing. But apart from that, we carried on as normal. We suspended subscriptions for a period. We offered free charging to sort of emergency service fleets and so on. So tried to do our bit. It was a very, very challenging period. But yeah, we've come out the other side of it, and we're rocking and rolling again and installing new charging points and getting the ones we installed before lockdown now live, hopefully. So we've got a few exciting sites coming up.
Excellent, because I have noticed a few charges which were sort of sitting ready to go and haven't quite got going. So I guess that's all down to that situation.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a few of the sites, obviously more complicated installations where we've installed sort of perhaps higher power chargers, the 150 kilowatt chargers, for example, in sort of hub locations where some of the nature of the installations basically means that there's more complexity involved, there's more third parties involved, there's lots of fairly boring legal decisions involved as well to overcome. You've got the not just the cost, but the grid connections, obviously, and the land issues that go alongside installing equipment on land that we may or may not own, for example. But yeah, we're very excited about getting some of those sites live. I mean, I won't go into specifics on this podcast, but a lot of the EV community spotted them out there and they've got green covers over them at the moment. But we are working really, really hard to get them live as soon as possible. And I've seen some updates on the schedule for the coming kind of month. It looks pretty exciting in terms of the number of sites we're going to have live by the end of the month.
Excellent. That's really good news. So we spoke last year about the fact that you were expanding with sites on BP forecourts where there were M&S food outlets, which are basically your franchise ones, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
And that definitely seems to have happened. We know there's a few gone live since we spoke, which is really good, and obviously all those ones we spoke about. So these are 150 kilowatt chargers?
They are. They're 150 kilowatt units. I mean, they can actually peak at the ABB unit actually peaks at 175 kilowatts. I think we're really trying to get sort of consumers to sort of come on this journey sort of with us all, obviously, and a lot of the speeds on the vehicles sort of seem to be stepping from 50 to 150. So we already got questions, for example, about our 150 kilowatt sort of chargers saying, well, I've only got a car that can do 50 kilowatts, so is mine compatible? Obviously, drivers don't necessarily understand that they're all backwards compatible. So we thought if we called them 175 kilowatt chargers, it might just confuse more people because they might think they're non-compatible with a vehicle, let's say a 150 kilowatt capable vehicle. So we've elected to kind of label them as 150 because that seems a logical step up. But as I say, they can peak at 175. We're typically putting at least 2 down at each site. We've done some installations with 4. In the future, we might do as many as 6, depending on obviously the power available, the power that we can afford to obviously buy in, and space is the key issue for us. Actually, now it's really shifted from that question of how much power can you get and how much is it going to cost you to actually the almost bigger question is how much land have you got, particularly in urban areas, where land is at a premium. It's quite hard to lay them down. So we've done quite a few sites now live. They are going great guns. I'm pleased to say. I mean, the utilisation is absolutely brilliant. We're seeing on those units. The units at our Hammersmith hub, BP flyover. We've got 4 ultra fast chargers there, and pre-lockdown, some of those units were getting used up to 30 times a day per charger, which was just a phenomenal utilisation level. So really pleased with the results so far. We also launched our first dealer site recently, so that's a site where it's not a BP company owned site, it's effectively a dealer's franchise site. So that's down in 3 Elm near Tunbridge in Kent, and that site is doing very well as well. So we're really pleased to be expanding across the board. And as I say, there's a lot more installations now coming through the pipeline. I think there were 3 or 4 that I've seen for sort of slated for sort of August. sort of switch on and go live, which is great. So once we're out of this this period of uncertainty, which I think we largely are, although we're all crossing our fingers that there isn't a big second wave lockdown coming. Hopefully drivers will see more of these sites popping up live all over the country.
Which is great, and particularly because they're at service stations, they're places where you can fairly easily spot them, which I think is really good. You usually see them from the road, which because they are quite tall units, aren't they? So they stand out a bit, which is gets around that old signage problem where you can't actually find them. So that's really good to see. So just a bit background for those people who are listening who perhaps don't know what BP Chargemaster is, where you came from, and also particularly the fact of the relationship to the Polar network, which I know sometimes confuses people.
Yeah, so I mean, BP Chargemaster is about a 12-year-old company now. I mean, I was involved with the company as much as 10 years ago, sort of as an external kind of consultant, and been working with the company just over 3 years now. It started, the Chargemaster as it then was, started as a company that was producing charging points, so assembling charging points predominantly for homes. So it recognised the need for people to charge on obviously domestic locations, and then looked at obviously the needs on public sites. And quite quickly saw the opportunity to create a network of chargers that would would allow people to sort of travel around. And obviously they started out as very slow chargers. The early electric cars only sort of had three pin sort of 13 amp or 10 amp power going into them, and obviously quickly scaled up through sort of your 3 kilowatt, 7 kilowatt type 2, and up to 50 kilowatt DC and beyond now to 150 kilowatts. So huge growth in speed obviously and scale of network. And the core network we have, obviously, the Polar network, it's our sort of UK-wide charging network. There is a lot of confusion, I think, still out there. We acquired, and that was a network that BP the Chargemaster grew from 2011. So it started that network in 2011 as the UK's first privately funded network. So it was the first company to actually roll out a network with private rather than government funding, back in over nearly 9 years ago now. And since then, obviously, much more private investment's gone in and to grow that network alongside some government projects as well. And we acquired back in sort of 2016-17 a business called Electromotive, which then operated a network called Charge Your Car, or CYC, as many current EV drivers know it. And that enabled us to kind of create extra network strength for some of our Polar customers. So we have different levels of access. Obviously, we provide sort of contactless payment on our new rapid chargers and ultra fast chargers, so you can tap and pay with a bank card, and that's obviously being retrofitted to our existing rapid chargers as well. So there shouldn't really be a rapid charger on the on it that we're operating, let's say in the next sort of 6 months, that you can't use a contactless bank card, and that's our aim. And obviously the rest of the estate, you have you have the pay as you go, obviously through a smartphone app, gets you a bit of discount, and then we have this subscription service that I think we're probably best known for, but I think it's not the only thing we do, obviously, which allows you to access both that Polar network and the legacy CYC network. Now, one thing clearly we would want to do is sort of consolidate slightly on that front over the coming sort of months and years. So there'll probably be some movement in that space where we start to rationalise that CYC legacy network a little bit, because I think a lot of drivers find that quite sort of jarring to find sort of two networks under one company. But it's a sort of a factor of the way that network is structured. Obviously, the charging points aren't always owned in a very sort of logical way, so we're trying to make sense of that for drivers and make it even easier to use the network we have.
That's good. I mean, that must be the only time I think I've used a CYC card was when I was planning a trip to Scotland, which got aborted because of everything happening. But I was thinking I needed the CYC to activate the Charge Play Scotland chargers. Yeah. But the
card question is really kind of a bit of a legacy thing now, and it's probably worth us sort of dwelling on that for a second. Is that we've gone from this sort of legacy world of where you probably genuinely did need a wallet full of RFID cards, as everyone loves saying. Maybe back in sort of the middle part of the 2010s, earlier than that. So now, obviously, we've got regulation in place from government that means that all charge points have to have a sort of pay-as-you-go system. And by the end of this year, really, you should be looking at all public charging points having this sort of true ad hoc facility where you just turn up and pay. You don't need any memberships at all, so you don't need any accounts set up with companies already. You don't need any RFID cards. You just turn up and pay a bit like you would pay for parking, let's say in a car park, if you turn up to a car park you've never been to before. So that should all be in place. There's regulation to enforce it. So we're in a whole different world today in terms of accessibility than we were, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago. It's just that not everyone knows that, and I think there is this still assumption that you still have to have a piece of plastic. I mean, I actually still love using that bit of plastic because it's a very quick way to access charging points, but you don't have to have that. There are options on the table.
So let's talk a little bit about that ad hoc regulation, because that confuses a lot of people. I've heard it said quite a lot that it's an enforcement of contactless payment, but it isn't, is it? It's just ad hoc payment.
That's right. So there's a regulation in place that came into force a while ago now. It was clarified a while ago in terms of what the government actually meant by sort of lack of a contract, I think the term was. But basically, you need to be able to go to a charging point you will ultimately need to be able to go to a charging point and use it without your personal or payment details being stored. Obviously, you can choose to have them stored if you choose an account system or a membership system. That's your choice, but you don't have to do that. So obviously, a lot of the new charging networks that only operate on a contactless basis, that's all fine because that's the only payment they offer. Whereas a few of us operators that have been in the market for sort of, as I say, 8-9 years now with legacy equipment, obviously we're adapting our systems to enable that. So as I say, by the end of the year, you'll have a system where you can sort of do what I would call, I guess, a guest payment. So you charge on the unit, and we just take payment, but we don't make you create an account. We don't store your details. We don't store your payment details, etc. Other than to pay for that charging session. So just creating a kind of a cleaner experience for the consumer. And on contactless, there is no current regulation around this. There's no current mandate. What the government has said, and we did a joint announcement with government last July on this, which was that the government has a vision that all new 50 kilowatt and above chargers will have a credit and debit card payment system. Doesn't have to be contactless, but I think that's how most operators are making that available, because it's sort of a very familiar product to the consumer. But it's a vision at the moment, and I'm sure it will be probably introduced in some form as a regulation, but it's not quite there yet. But I think, as I say, I'm not aware of many charging networks that aren't bringing in contactless, and as I say, we're retrofitting it as well as installing it from new now. So there might be one or two networks out there, but I think my view will probably be that consumers will vote with their feet, and they'll probably choose charging networks that offer that sort of ease of use.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, I must admit, I've been a Polo network member since I started driving an EV. In fact, probably even before I started driving an EV regularly, because I used to have review cars. And I've always found that convenience really, really handy, just being able to tap and go. So, and that's one of the things you probably know from my Twitter feed, I've got a bit of bee in my bonnet about chargers at the moment, how convenient and how easy of use they are. And I have to say, your new ones are very easy to use. It's just tap and basically start charging. So that's the way it should be.
Absolutely. I think what's I mean, just to pull that out more, I mean, one of the key things for us is recognizing the different needs that different users have. So as a private driver, we recognize that a lot of people probably won't need many chargers nationwide. They'll probably need a few local ones then for regular journeys, and then a couple on long journeys when they go traverse the country, let's say. So things like contactless work phenomenally well for the sort of what I would say the average private motorist. But when we get into the sort of the business vehicle space and the fleet space, what we see is actually a complete pivot away from that. So actually contactless is almost the last thing that those drivers want, or those users want, because actually they don't want to pay for their own fuel because they've got a fuel card for their own diesel car at the moment, and the fleet managers are saying to going to market and saying, does anyone offer a single invoice billing solution for all our public charging? And obviously we do on our network, increasingly growing network, and obviously we're also introducing it on a fuel card as well, optionally. So it's funny, the different requirements. We sort of obsess about contactless for sort of the private motorists and how important that is, but actually if you then focus on fleets, actually they couldn't care less about contactless for the most part, because they want to consolidate all of their costs in one place.
Yeah, a contactless is actually a right pain for them, because they don't usually get receipts.
As a choice, it's great, and that's our sort of mantra really on these. Is it's about providing choice. So yes, we'll have contactless. Yes, we provide the app if someone wants that, and yes, we'll obviously provide that sort of subscription, single invoicing if a fleet wants that as well. Yeah.
So let's talk about app, because I guess that's the one thing which has been mentioned as a negative towards your network at times, is the complexity of because you've got basically at the moment initially you had 2 apps, I believe, and I think you're consolidating that.
That's right. So we as I say, it's and a lot of the pain in the EV charging industry generally that consumers feel is often to do with, if you like, legacy systems and legacy hardware, for example. The legacy around that is obviously that we started out, and obviously, as I say, everyone knows as a subscription network, but funnily enough, we started out as a pay-as-you-go network. I mean, the Polar network was only available on a pay-as-you-go basis originally back in sort of 2011 and so on. So we had this app called Polar Instant, which was the pay-as-you-go solution. And then the subscription product, as everyone knows, and obviously some people love, some people don't. That's fine. Came out in 2015. So I think we sort of launched it as the sort of Netflix of EV charging almost. You pay a subscription fee, and then some of your content's free, some of it's low cost. And that then sort of came as a separate solution. So the digital sort of platform around that was developed separately. Now, most of the people that have been involved in that have sort of gone into pastures new, and there's no blame attached to anyone. But at the time, it was developed in parallel as digital platform, Polar Plus rather than Polar Instant. Obviously, in hindsight, it would have been much more sensible to develop a singular app for everything. That's now what we've done. We have developed it. We're testing it, as you know. So we'll be consolidating all of that into one environment, so you can choose your method of access through one app rather than having to choose between two apps. And obviously in future we'll also seek to integrate other services within that. So for example, the aim would clearly be to have, say, home charging within that environment as well, which is currently in its own smart charge app for our smart home charging. So it's really a case of legacy sort of systems that have developed over the years, bringing them all together. And again, making more sense for the consumer, so that there isn't this kind of jarring and sort of confusion between what we actually offer.
Which is brilliant. And I must admit, I love the way your apps, the direction your app's going is great. I mean, obviously it is early days, and there's still lots of work to do on it, but it looks like it's going to be good.
Absolutely, and I hope that's what other people find, and I think it's I suspect the pain that some people have obviously flagged, and the frustration some people flagged before, and we recognise that. We don't sort of shy away from that. It wasn't a good app originally, the Polar Instant app, for example, before you revised it, and then obviously it's then changing again. Was that the business really started in that infrastructure space. So it started as an infrastructure company building out infrastructure, and then the sort of technology, if you like, got laid on top. Now, I think other businesses are coming at this from a technology first, if you like, direction, and then the infrastructure is almost incidental. And that's we are much more of a technology company today than we were, let's say, 5 years ago, and we have much more technological expertise, both internally and externally, that we sort of bring in, that is helping us on that journey. So I'd say we're as a business. I mean, I'm lucky to have been exposed to the company for well over a decade now, and we're in such a different place now than we were 5 years ago, and there's some really, really exciting products coming down the line. Excellent,
that's really good. So you're an EV driver yourself, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah, have been for many years, yeah.
So you've driven, I think you've driven several EVs, haven't you, over the years?
I've probably had far more company cars than most people have had in sort of 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
So is it? I'm trying to remember. Are you on a Kia now?
Yeah, I've got an e-Niro at the moment. I had I sort of went through a BMW i3. A Renault Zoe, 40 kWh Renault Zoe, 30 kWh Leaf, and a sort of second generation e-Golf before I got to the Kia, and obviously drove pretty much everything else in between that on a short term basis for a day or two here and there. So I've driven most EVs some distance, I suppose, which is great because it gives you that comparison point between sort of what everyone's doing. But yeah, love the Kia. I think it's probably sort of bang for your buck. Probably still the best thing out there overall in value. I still can't kind of quite believe how they do it for the money. But yeah, there's been some great sort of experiences over the years. I mean, the Golf as a vehicle that was never built as an EV. The Golf was based on an existing platform, obviously not like the IDs coming now. The Golf was fantastic. I absolutely loved the e-Golf, and it was hugely efficient as well. You're sort of over 5 miles per kilowatt hour. So there's some interesting sort of nuggets along the way that you pick up that you didn't necessarily expect.
If I could get 5 miles per kilowatt hour at my iPace, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun, isn't it? The efficiency of EVs is very similar to the efficiency of an ICE, isn't it? In terms of the bigger, more luxurious vehicles are generally less efficient, but I guess that's the same in most spaces. It's sort of the price you pay, isn't it? But I mean, I'm a huge fan of the iPace. Driven quite a few of them. I'm lucky enough to go on the global launch as well, and I just think the mixture of the sort of design, the interior packaging, for its size, it's a hilarious car in some ways, because obviously it looks quite big, and then you park a Renault Zoe next to it and you realise it's exactly the same height as a Renault Zoe, which is just bizarre, and so the packaging and the sort of the space you get is great, and obviously the way it drives fantastic. So if I have a choice about what's next after the Kia, an I-Pace is very high on that list.
Well, the next model year is coming out, so it's nice tweaks. I mean, one of the great things, again, just talking on the I-Pace side of things, is that your network has been one of the few which has been from day one fully compatible with the iPace. The iPace has had, well, there's been issues with chargers in the iPace. Which side of the fence I'm not sure that's been on, but there's definitely have been compatibility issues. It's just something I hear quite regularly with all cars on CCS, that there's been a lot of compatibility issues. Is that something you find as a challenge going?
So I mean, without getting too sort of nerdy, and there's a risk of that with me, as you know, Gary, getting too nerdy. I mean, I think in general, not just CCS, but the way that let me give you an analogy. So I used to do a lot of work in the PR world for Bosch. Everyone knows Bosch, and most people know that from appliances, but obviously they're one of the biggest, if not automotive component suppliers, and they have a system called Electronic Stability Program, or ESP, which they co-developed with Mercedes-Benz, which basically stops you skidding. Now that is an off-the-shelf unit, right? That you can buy. You can buy an ESP sort of control, an ESP sort of system, but it's then how it performs in the car is then up to the engineers who then integrate into the car. So they might integrate it so that if it's in a BMW M3, it doesn't kick in as early as in 320D BMW, for example. So the way you integrate any technology is variable, and I think with charging it's much the same. So there are sort of protocols around charging and tolerances. And the way that different car companies, if you like, engineer that into their car varies. And obviously the way that charging companies, if you like, implement those protocols can vary a little bit as well. And we're talking about minute tolerances. So we do find it a little bit, and it can, I mean, all I'd say is the most important thing is testing. I mean, the iPace was tested very extensively on our charging network, our public charging network, and a lot of EV drivers saw that at the time. Particularly up at the old 50 kilowatt charger that we used to have up at Warwick, the harvester there before the site changed hands. So it got very extensively tested, thousands and thousands of miles, and that's really the way you sort of iron out these challenges, if there are to be any. So that's the importance of it. And we've had it with another maker model, which I won't disclose, but it was actually on I think it was on Chargemaster rather than CCS in the end, and it was to do with the fact that our charger was basically sending back a signal to the car that it was safe to charge too early. So the car's sort of minimum tolerance for time that it would accept a sort of safe state message from the charger was X, and ours was below X. So we were actually too quick, in terms of giving a safety message to the car. So it's little things like that you for consumers, obviously, it's hugely frustrating and that doesn't work. But it just shows the power of good collaboration between sort of suppliers and the car manufacturers in our industry.
Yeah, I know it's really good. I think that's actually one of the things which really confuses a lot of consumers. I mean, I've heard this said several times. But I do a lot of beginner guide type stuff for new iPace drivers and training sort of video calls. And the comment I've often heard is, it's just plugging in electricity. Why is it not like just plugging a plug into a socket? Why doesn't it just work? And people just don't get the complexity. And there was a really good reason for that complexity, because it's basically safety, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, especially if you're doing with 400 volts, or potentially up to sort of 800 volts on some of the newer cars. And not just the volt, the voltage is one thing, obviously, but the power you're sending through. I mean, our 150 kilowatt chargers, we've got them configured in such a way that they don't necessarily also do this, but they can take 375 amps through them, sort of thing. So it is safety, absolutely, and also some of it's about, I guess, the convenience factor, right? So I mean, I'm not actually sat in a forecourt right now. I'm sat in an office with laundry hanging up all around me, so I won't show you that. But there's plug sockets around me, and obviously there's plugs in there that I can pull out straight away, with no sort of authentication, as it were, right? So as a consumer, would you want someone to be able to unplug your EV at any time? No, of course you don't. So even things like the protocols around the solenoids and locking the cable in have to be part of that sort of. It's not just the sort of safety from an electricity point of view, it's also the kind of, I guess, the security element of the safety that's important as well, to make sure that the cables can't be removed or anything while the charging's happening and so on. So yeah, I mean, the aim is always with everything to remove that complexity, though. So whatever we see and whenever we develop something, our focus now is always about how do we make this simpler, how do we make this easier for the consumer, both to understand and to use, right?
Yeah, and that's the other statement I always get on all these trainings. Why is it so complex? Why is it so difficult to charge? Why is it not like just putting a pump in a petrol? That's
yeah. And I mean, I sort of have nice anecdotes around that. In terms of I think people think petroleum industry evolved a lot quicker than it did in terms of the consumer experience. And you have to remember that you used to get petroleum spirit at the side of the road in a glass bottle from a chemist. You didn't buy on a forecourt back in the early days of driving a motor car. So it went from glass bottles outside chemists to to pumps and so on. And I think actually the first I couldn't believe this, but the first self-serve petrol pump in the UK was only opened in something like 1962 or something.
Yep.
Yeah,
I'm old enough to remember my local petrol station changing over from being operated to self-service, and that was a major thing.
It took decades for the and it's the same. It's a different set of challenges, but it's that same thing of how it's an industry working out how do we best serve the consumer while operating the business and growing and developing and everything else. So it's no different to any other sector. It's going to have challenges and growing pains, and all we ask is we're always happy to have feedback from drivers on stuff that doesn't work or doesn't work as well as it should, and we'll try and improve it. And as I say, we're laser focused now on just sort of simplicity, making that consumer experience really smooth, making it logical, and just helping drivers understand it. Because our customer care team, we're one of the first companies to bring in a 24/7 customer care team sort of back in the day. And even now, they still get a lot of calls that are simply, how do I use this car, basically, because the handover process that they got from the person they bought it from wasn't very good, bluntly. And we're sort of educating people about their car as much as we're educating them about our charging network.
And unfortunately, that's happened a lot more in the last few months as well, because obviously with everything going on, the handovers have been a lot less thorough, perhaps, than they would be previously. I mean, it'll come. People, familiarity with electric cars will come in, and people will just know how to do it the same way as we do with petrol cars these days. We know when most people know to plug petrol in rather than diesel, etc., depending what they're doing, and it's very straightforward. But that took a while to come. Now, you mentioned feedback, so I did actually ask some listeners for a couple of questions, points. One thing which we got quite often was length of cable on the chargers. I know some of this is down to safety and voltage and things, but also I think it's a lot down to the car manufacturers designing things a bit crazily in some cases. I know you pointed out the position of the charge point on a new car the other week on the Twitter feed, which I think was a very valid point.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, as I say, without sort of DC, and this is obviously on DC tethered cables. I mean, our sort of preference when we put them down usually is to put them sort of straddling a bay, so that depending on what car you have, one of the bays will work for you fine, because you can position it in different ways. Generally, they kind of work okay if there's a single charger at the end of a bay as well for most cars. It can be a little bit of a stretch, but if you can kind of pull up quite tight, you can generally manage it. But it is a challenge when you're dealing with this sort of that type of location where you're dealing with kind of a car park situation, because you're effectively asking the consumer to park next to the thing that they're using to, in quite a specific bay. Whereas obviously on a forecourt, for example, if you put up to a forecourt pump, there's usually quite a lot of latitude in terms of, how far you pull forward or back, whether you park on the left or right side. So there is, I think, it would probably be a good thing if the charging ports were in a more consistent location, I think, across the board, and then we could plan it better as an industry. That you don't get sort of random petrol fillers on the top of roofs of cars and stuff. It's always either on the front or rear flank, isn't it? So, well, the front flank if it's a Porsche, I guess, and the rear flank for everything else. But it's always in that same sort of domain. So it would help. I think it's less of a problem now that you've got things like sort of 150 kilowatt chargers, where some of those cars with the more sort of adverse, shall we say, filler positions tend to be the high powered cars, and then sort of the chargers have longer cables on those anyway, because they're taller units. But I think we've definitely taken that feedback on board. At the time, obviously, we rolled out a charger that was of a certain height so that we could install it faster, because it fell below planning permission height threshold. That's now changed, so we've got more flexibility. So, if there's a kind of an ultra charged sort of Mark II 50 kilowatt unit sort of in future, obviously, I would expect it would probably have slightly longer cables. Yeah.
And the other point, which is again something I've been banging on about on Twitter, as you probably have noticed, is the whole point of using chargers in the rain and wet screens, but also which has come up in the last few weeks, glare on screens as well. That seems to be a big issue for a lot of people. They can't read what's on the screen.
Yes. Yeah, so we're looking at all of those issues really. I mean, the canopy thing's an interesting one. I was on a round table call a while ago with the industry about this, and there was an interesting point that got raised by a company. I won't say who they were, but they actually had trialed canopies, and they were in the chargers were in a certain type of location, shall we say, and they actually saw an increase in crime. Locally, so they were basically providing, and they obviously sort of larger shelters, but they actually said they had to take them down because they were seeing an increase in sort of antisocial behaviour, people using them as kind of a place to sort of hide and do mischievous things. So there's always sort of unintended consequences, but ultimately the idea of obviously sort of making it better for EV drivers is clearly something we want to do. So we are looking at ways we can effectively, provide some kind of canopy. Let's say, it might not be separate. Could it be integrated in the charger? All those kind of questions are coming out.
Yeah, I've often said just as some sort of jutting out bit on the front of the car charger would be enough to get around that problem. Because I'm not so worried about myself getting wet, but the problem tends to be that you can't operate the charger as easily when it's raining.
The sort of screen, and on the screen front, screen sort of shades and things like that. Certainly something we've looked at before. The screen on our 50 kilowatt unit doesn't tend to have the same issue because actually it's slightly tilted. Yep. So it's at a slight angle, whereas the I know sort of flatter screens tend to be more of a challenge, and smaller screens as well. So, again, one of the things that we've always seen on our own equipment is that because we are an EV charging company and that's the only thing we do, we've not spun up. We're not an industrials business that's gone into EV charging with industrial equipment. We've started building EV charging sort of off the shelf. We designed it sort of, if you like, fit for purpose. So the big sort of 12-inch touchscreens, we've had loads of feedback from people about, their kids love to use them and all sorts because they're very intuitive. And even on our 150 kilowatt chargers that we've developed, so the ones that you saw at Fully Charged Live last year, that we've now got the first two installed at our head office. So the rollout, the ones we've been using for our rollout are actually the ABB units. But with the ones we've installed at head office, they've got quite big touchscreens, much more sort of like our 50 kilowatt charger. So I think it's just a case of, test the infrastructure properly, make it fit for purpose. Yeah, we might go down the road of sort of shades and or some sort of anti-glare screens, etc. But as I say, sometimes you can test these things, and there'll be an edge case that you don't quite quite kind of go and see. Rain is not an edge case clearly, but there's there are some exceptions. And again, the thing on canopies is we've got, for goodness me, sort of 6,000-7,000 charging location points out there, probably 5,000 locations. Do you go retrofit canopies if that's something that everyone wants? Does it only go on rapids? There's all kind of those kind of questions. And obviously the other challenge is, again, it comes back to this land issue where if you install charging points, if you're installing canopies, that are above a certain height so that tall people can get under them as well, you then suddenly go from a non-planning situation to a planning permission situation, and then you're delaying the rollout of infrastructure. So it's always a delicate balance with this industry. Is how fast are you able to roll out versus the kind of regulations and the sort of nice to haves that you could add on. But I think my parting word on it is that if we can make the experience of using the charger as quick as possible, it actually reduces your needs to be outside anyway, right? So it's almost like being in a car park and opening the door, shutting the door, and walking away from the car. We want to get to nearer that experience rather than sit there with if you can operate the app from inside the car, for example, if it's an app, or tap your card quickly and plug in, and then it's 5 seconds. That's the aim.
Yeah, or as we spoke about last year, the whole idea of plug and charge, auto charge type operation, which I know CCS standards has that actually been finally resolved the CCS standard for plug and charge.
It's available, so you can implement it, but obviously it's sort of dependent on the car. I think one of these things is I think we're sort of looking at these innovations quite closely and wondering kind of where whether there's sort of consistency called for, because obviously if you've got a there's things that Callow can do that CCS can't, like V2G. There's things that CCS can do that Callow can't, like sort of plug and charge sort of protocol type things. It's interesting to kind of see whether they're going to be a long-term desire or whether they're more of a nice to have again. Because I think if you can offer a very quick experience for plugging in the car anyway, for the if you like the time it might take to do a sort of implementation of, say, a plug and charge to the protocol, it might not be necessary. And I think, as I say, I think Tesla's provided a great experience through that system, and because it's always been there, I think no one ever sort of thinks, well, what could the alternative have been to that plug and charge system? So we continue to look at all of those sort of innovations as to whether we might introduce them.
Yeah, I think plug and charge. I've had some couple of conversations with fleet people recently, and they love the idea of plug and charge because it's so convenient for their fleets. But no lost cards was with the comment I got.
Well, there is obviously that. There's and again, you kind of get the edge case, and then you get the counterpoint. And I've had people sort of argue that, sort of say to me, actually, I was speaking to a police officer a while back about EV charging and kind of what implications there were for crime reporting, which is a very boring conversation. But one of the things they said about plug and charge was, well, if they can charge the car without any ID, sort of actually that's not great if the car gets stolen. which is a good point. If it gets
Yeah,
done, you don't know for a while. But it's just sort of, as I say, there's always a sort of an unintended consequence lurking somewhere that you have to consider and think, well, hang on, is that a good idea?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that people. I mean, the whole thing like canopies. As a consumer, you just say, "Why am I getting wet in the car?" But you don't realise those on impacts, and that's why it's great to have these sort of conversations.
Absolutely,
It's great. Well, Tom, thank you ever so much for your time today. I know you're a busy man and off on hold soon, so that's even better. So thanks for your time, and we will have to do this again next year when all this is everything else has improved, hopefully.
We'd love to, yeah, and it's my pleasure. So thanks for the opportunity, Gary. Really appreciate it. And as I say, we are always very happy to hear from EV drivers, whether they're a customer or not. To be honest, if they're not a customer, then they've got a reason why, and that's great to hear. And obviously, if they are a customer, letting us know how they're getting on. Good or bad feedback. In terms of if there's any issues, we always love to hear. So I always welcome opportunities to communicate with EV drivers, whether that's directly or through fine people such as yourself. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
No problem at all.
Thanks, Tom. It's always a great pleasure speaking to Tom. Thoroughly enjoyed doing that interview. And finally enjoyed doing all the State of the EVs in the UK interviews this year. I'll be back with these next year. But in the meantime, there'll be a lot more content on this channel. Don't go away. Like and subscribe if you have liked these. And I'll see you on the next one.